So with that, take it away, Don Lyons, Aleutian Terns. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Gay, for the invitation to talk a little bit about a tern species that Jill and I both love. And it's great to meet some of you from Nome. I have not yet been to Nome, but it's high on my list. I'm hoping potentially next summer to visit. But tonight we'll talk about Aleutian terns. I love Gay's title, Who is the Other Alaskan Tern? It really is a lesser known and kind of enigmatic species. And I hope we can kind of share with you what the history of Aleutian terns are in Alaska, what some recent work that's gotten started is trying to learn and has learned, and some of the still outstanding questions we're chasing with this species. And I will, let's see. I will take a moment to figure out how to advance my slides. There we go. Probably the tern most of you are familiar with is the Arctic tern, a bit more common in your neck of the woods, and a very similar sized tern to Aleutians. Arctics, of course, are pretty well known for being aggressive defenders of their nests. They also have a solid red bill, a solid black cap, and make the most amazing migrations. Arctic terns, it's believed, make the longest annual migration of any vertebrate, going all the way to the Antarctic. Most individuals, or many individuals at least, during our winter, and then coming back here for the summer. I've been very fond of one name given this species, and that's the bird of light. I think they experience more daylight throughout an annual cycle than probably any other. Being at high latitudes, both during the northern hemisphere summer and the southern hemisphere summer. So they are definitely a creature of the sun. Another tern that you folks are probably seeing a few more of, maybe every year, is the Caspian Tern. That's the largest tern species in the world in terms of body size, and they're quite abundant along the Pacific coast of North America. The center of their distribution has been Oregon and Washington for several decades, but in the last 20 years or so, more birds have started breeding in Alaska, and there's even Caspian terns to your north of Nome, nesting in the last couple of years. So another tern species. You won't confuse this one with an Aleutian tern because it's both much larger and has a pretty harsh call. So a wonderful bird, but not the one we're looking to talk about today. Of course, what we're looking to talk about today is the Aleutian tern, and it's unique among terns in Alaska in terms of having a white blaze on the forehead, as this photo shows so well, an all black bill, and then the actually most diagnostic characteristic among terns for Aleutian terns is a dark band at the trailing edge of the secondaries. And if you can see my mouse, I'm pointing to that dark band, and that's novel among terns, and a great way to distinguish this species from other similar ones if you don't get a chance to look at the forehead, say from underneath if it's flying over top. And so just a little additional way to identify them. Aleutian terns are quite a mysterious species. There's not been very much study of them, and they really hold a lot of mysteries yet. Even their migration, where they spent the winter, was not really well known until 20 years or so ago. It turns out they winter in Southeast Asia, primarily Indonesia, but some other locations as well. And 20 years ago, you could not even open a bird guidebook for that area and find the Aleutian tern because they didn't know they had them. During the winter, Aleutian terns look very much like another species of tern, common terns, in winter plumage. They share a very similar winter plumage, except for that trailing dark band on the end of the secondary flight feathers on the wing. So it's certainly an interesting bird to study, and one that Jill and I have enjoyed working with for several years now. Aleutian terns are a member of the Onychoprion genus, and they're kind of an outlier among that genus of terns. Their closest relatives, sooty terns and bridled terns, for example, are tropical species that never come anywhere near as high a latitude as Alaska. The yellow bands here around the equator for each of these species show you the distribution of these two species. And all of the members of this genus actually are tropical, with the exception of Aleutian terns. And I frequently describe Aleutian terns as a tropical tern that got lost and made its way to the far north to nest. And so they're doing something pretty different. And I guess you could say they're trying to figure it out because it's not an environment that this group of birds is very familiar with. But Aleutian terns do come to Alaska to nest. This map actually shows their entire breeding distribution. They only nest in the North Pacific, in Alaska and the Russian Far East. You can see that they nest along most of the coastline of Alaska, is in the southeast as far as Glacier Bay, and then in a few locations in the Chukchi Sea, and almost everywhere in between in scattered colonies. In Russia, they nest around the Sea of Okhotsk, as well as the Bering Sea. It turns out in Russia, they have a slightly different view of when the bird was discovered and who discovered it first. And in Russia, it's known as the Kamchatka tern. And there certainly are a large number of breeding colonies around the Kamchatka Peninsula. So that is not entirely without merit. There's also a number of very large colonies, actually the largest colonies for the species, on Sakhalin Island to the north of Japan. So a pretty limited breeding distribution for this species of tern, and unusual among the genus that it's so far north. And to kind of introduce why we're focused on Aleutian terns now, I want to mention a paper that came out a few years ago by Heather Renner and some colleagues. Some of you may know Heather. She's with the Alaska Maritime National Wildlife Refuge. And I want you to pay a little attention to the background of this slide. Each little square represents the population trend for a given colony in Alaska the known colonies where Aleutian terns nest. And you don't need to pay attention to any of the detail other than to note that almost all of those dashed trend lines are going down. So Aleutian terns are declining at known colonies across the state. So in all of the different habitats of coastal Alaska. And some of those declines, if you compile them, they're quite severe. So more than an 80% decline, the best estimate is around 92% decline since 1960. And that's precipitous and definitely a conservation concern. And after this paper came out, the IUCN, which has a classification system for species globally in terms of their population status, shifted Aleutian terns to their vulnerable category. Not quite threatened yet, but definitely a species of significant concern. And it's interesting, these declines across the state suggest some kind of large-scale pattern. This work was published in 2015. The surveys were done primarily in 2013. And since then, the level of concern has been significant. And there's been a lot of people interested in learning more, learning if these trends at known colonies where we know to go look for these birds is real, or whether maybe birds are potentially moving to places we don't know about and aren't counting, or some other explanation. So a relatively large group of partners embarked on research efforts that really came into discussion in 2016 and started in earnest in 2017. And a lot of those partners are listed here. Certainly several of the government agencies that operate in Alaska, the Department of Fish and Game at the state level, the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Forest Service at the federal level. There's universities involved, where Jill and I are at Oregon State University, but also the University of Alaska Southeast, and actually a geneticist is involved who's based in Connecticut, and a couple of consulting companies, Audubon, and the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation has been a strong financial and logistical supporter of the effort as well. So a lot of people are very interested in what's going on with this species and actively participating in research efforts. And there's a number of outstanding questions that we're hoping to address. As I mentioned, one is just where are these birds? And are they in places we don't currently know about? Have birds shifted to new nesting locations, for example, that we haven't tracked? And this photo, it's a bit blurry, but this photo represents one of those unknown places. This is Clark's Point, which is down in Bristol Bay, about 50 miles from Dillingham. And it was not previously known to be an Aleutian Tern colony, but it is a fish camp, and people spend summers there. And fish and game biologists were actually able to visit the site and quickly found Aleutian Terns, including this fledgling that was hanging out on one of the roads in a convenient place to be photographed. So one key question we have is, can we just map the distribution of birds and identify where colonies are, where birds are nesting? And are we losing colonies, gaining colonies? Are we holding steady on the number of colonies around the state? Another question, which is more challenging than you might think. Certainly it's more challenging than I thought it would be when I got involved, is just how do we count them? This photo is of a typical Aleutian Tern colony. You can see vegetation on the ground. You can see a bunch of birds in the air. This is during some kind of disturbance event, maybe an eagle flew over or some other stimulus caused these birds to, or most birds, presumably, to lift off the ground, off their nests and fly. It's kind of challenging to count the number of birds when these events happen, and they're moving quite rapidly and circling, and especially if there's a large number of birds, if it's a large colony, it can be quite difficult to count birds accurately. One method that can help is taking a photograph while they're in the air. For example, we could all count the number of birds in this photograph, but taking photographs that capture all of the birds and having some idea of, well, are all the birds in the air or are there some still on the ground, hidden by that vegetation, is still a real challenge. So this is a significant question in terms of, can we assess whether this population of birds is doing okay or not? First, we just have to figure out how to count them to know how many are out there. Another question is, well, if terns are declining in Alaska, which those earlier data suggest they may be, well, how are they doing in Russia? And we have been in touch with Russian colleagues, and a few of us, myself and a couple other folks, went over to Russia a couple of years ago, visiting the sites on Sakhalin Island where the largest colonies had been documented in the last decade or two. And there are a lot of birds there. There's definitely more Aleutian terns in Russia than in Alaska. And so it seems like they're doing okay there. But the level of monitoring there is also very limited, much like Alaska. So detecting a trend is not easy. So we're still, they're probably in better shape than we are for this species, but we still don't know if they're trending downward as well as we are. While in Russia, we were able to investigate some ways to count birds, and that primary technique was flying a drone over them. The photo you see of those two birds on the ground was taken with a drone, and so we are making some progress in how to count them while they're nesting, but more work there is to be done, and Jill will highlight some of the other techniques being considered. Yeah. And I'll turn it over to Jill right now and let her share with you some of the work she's involved with as part of her master's degree. And bear with us, I'm going to keep advancing the slides while Jill talks. So hopefully we'll coordinate relatively well. But Jill, take it away.
Thanks, Don. So besides drones, another method that we are investigating as a group statewide is using acoustics. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that and what we've learned so far using acoustics. And so like I said, this has been going on across the state, and this year, thank you to some great people up in Nome, we were able to get our first song meter out up there this year, so that was exciting. Yeah, so when we started thinking about what methods that we wanted to use to study Aleutian terns, we thought that acoustics might work for a couple of reasons. Sometimes tern colonies aren't always easy to access, so we were looking for methods that could give us the most information for only a few visits to each site. And due to the storage capacity and the battery life of acoustic recorders, we could go to a colony at the beginning of the season and put the song meter out and leave it there for the whole season. And when we pick it up, it'll have a full summer season of data without us being there and disturbing the birds. And there are some anecdotal notes that Aleutian terns can be sensitive in some locations to disturbance. So minimizing our disturbance when we can is always a good option. Also, the data is archivable, so we can analyze it again in the future with different methods or to look at different questions. So we've been using song meter units made by Wildlife Acoustics. And so the black box on the right side of the slide shows one of these units in a metal lockbox. This is the one in Nome. So this unit records 1 minute out of every 5 minutes between sunrise and sunset for the duration of the summer. So it's quite a bit of data. The timing of tern breeding varies between different regions in Alaska. So we try to get units out in early May before the terns arrive and then leave them out there until late August. Even if the terns don't breed or they fail and leave much earlier than August, we try to leave them out just in case birds from other colonies come in and investigate that site. Yeah, so here on the next slide, we have some examples of what Aleutian tern calls look like. And this type of visualization of sound, excuse me, is called a spectrogram. So here on this figure, we have the frequency in kilohertz on the vertical axis and the time in seconds on the horizontal axis. So this first box has 2 examples of a typical trill flight call. This is the one that you usually hear whenever you're walking near terns that are just flying around. It's their kind of musical whistle call. And then this middle call is another type of flight call that's a little bit more buzzy. And then this last box has some of their alarm calls. It's just a quick note that they give when they're alerted by something. And one question I get a lot about acoustics data is, does someone have to go through and listen to all this data and manually count these calls within all of those recordings that we make? And luckily, we don't have to. That would take a lot of time. But we use a method called, we build this deep neural network, which is a type of machine learning that we train these algorithms to identify the shape of these sound calls within the sound files. So then we can just run our acoustic files through this neural network and pull out the calls. And this is done by a company, by Conservation Metrics, and they specialize in this type of analysis. I can try to answer any questions about deep neural networks. I'm not an expert, but I'm happy to talk about it if anyone is interested. So once they process the data and give us back a call rate, an estimate of call rates per minute, we can start looking at the data in more depth. So on the next slide, here's our first figure that I would like to show you, and this shows the daily vocalization distribution across all colonies in 2018. So here we have the call rate on the vertical axis and the minutes from sunrise on the horizontal axis, and this dashed bold line indicates sunrise. So to the left is at night and the right is during the day. So it's kind of a nice clean shape. And the first 2 things that kind of jump out when you look at this is that the terns are not vocalizing at night. They're pretty quiet. And then there's this peak of vocalization right here in the morning, between 90 and 270 minutes. So these 2 bits of information can be pretty useful to us. So for the morning peak and call rate, this might be a good time for us to coordinate surveys. For instance, maybe the birds are more detectable or more of the birds associated with a colony are present at that time of day. So this is good for us to know. And also, when we realized that the terns weren't calling at night, we stopped recording at night in 2019 and 2020, and this allowed us to save some memory space so we could have longer deployments of the song meters. So that's that. And then next, we have been looking at the seasonal vocal activity at individual colonies. So this figure is just showing the data from one colony. It's a tiny island colony located in the southern part of the Kodiak archipelago. And this is 2018 once again. So here we have time from sunrise now is on the vertical axis and the date is on the horizontal. And once again, the dashed line is sunrise. So it's a heat map. So cool colors are low calling and the warmer colors are higher calling rates. So it looks like the birds are pretty active at the beginning of the season, and then suddenly there's this drop. It just goes blue for a little bit right there. And this had me wondering, what happened there? What happened to the colony? And luckily we had some cameras up at this colony, and we were able to go back and reference to see what potentially had disturbed the colony. And what we found was that this little red fox had swam over from the mainland, Kodiak Island, to the colony and gone from nest to nest, unfortunately. And since it's a tiny island, there weren't very many tern nests. It was pretty efficient at causing colony failure. Red foxes are our #1 predator in the Kodiak archipelago for Aleutian terns. So I wasn't really that surprised to see him out here, unfortunately. And you can see the song meter up in the background, on the back of the picture. Sorry, Dawn. But this is just an example of, you can get pretty good information about occupancy at tern colonies using the acoustics data. All right, now I'm ready for the last figure with the acoustics work. There we go. Thank you. So with this last one, we're looking at the relationship of call rates to colony counts. So on our vertical axis, we have counts of Aleutian terns that observers have made in the field when out looking for birds. And on the horizontal axis, we have the call rate once again. And don't worry about the little tiny fine print that you can't read. That's just the colony name and the date. But what you can see here is that there is a positive relationship between count and the call rate. Unfortunately, we don't have very many points out here where the big colonies are, and I'm hoping that when we can pull data across years to make this relationship a little bit more robust. Our colonies, especially the colonies that are accessible and we can make multiple counts at frequently, they're all very small. So it kind of biases this towards the small colony side. But hopefully, with more years of data, we can understand this a little bit better. Our goal is to see if there is a strong relationship between call rate and number of birds, because then we could use this relationship to estimate the number of birds at a colony based on the acoustics. And this would be really useful for colonies where we don't ever get to see the birds actually at the colony. So this would be great for all those remote sites. And this, like everything else I'm going to talk about today, is something we're still working on, so stay tuned. Okay, so that's all I have for the acoustics project. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about what I'm doing down in the Kodiak archipelago. So I've got 4 main topics I'm going to highlight today, including monitoring nest survival, nest site habitat selection, chick diet, and female diet prior to egg laying. We don't have, as Dawn has mentioned, very much information about the basic breeding ecology of the species. So a lot of this work is aimed at trying to fill in some of those gaps so we can learn more about the species and hopefully move forward with conservation measures in the future. All right, so let's go on to that first one. Nest monitoring. So in the Kodiak archipelago, I'm pretty lucky because I can drive to multiple colonies. So it makes intensive nest monitoring pretty easy. And I have, since there are multiple colonies, I have backups in case some ultimately fail or they don't nest, which is always the case. It seems like rarely are all of the potential colony sites actually active. So when I go out to colonies, I'm always looking out for nests. And as you can see from the picture on the left, the eggs can be very hard to see. I have it circled in red, but they're very well camouflaged with the mossy substrate and the grass at these colonies in Kodiak. So when I find a nest, take a GPS point, and then I float the egg, and floating allows us to age the egg. So the egg in the picture here is about 3 to 4 days old, I would say, since it's sitting at the bottom of the container and it's still pretty horizontal in there. And this aging eggs is important so we can figure out the daily nest survival rate. So how long nests are actually surviving once they are initiated. All right, so then when I find nests, I try to revisit them once a week. And for a subset of those nests, I place a camera to monitor them in more depth. So these cameras are programmed to take a photo once every 2 minutes, as well as when they are triggered by motion. So the purpose of the cameras is to capture nest failure. So like in this picture, you can click it one more time, Dawn. See if it'll work. There we go. So we can capture causes of nest failure. So here is an example of a fox eating a nest. You can see the egg in its mouth. Some other predators that we have seen include black-billed magpies, northwestern crows, seagulls, bears, a domestic sheep at one of the colonies. There's a whole suite of predators and other causes of nest failure that we see. So we also use the timed images to look at nest attendance rates. You can click it, Don. Sorry, there's a lot of just pictures on this slide.
Yeah, sorry, there's a little bit of a delay too, Jill. I'm trying to gauge how long that takes. Yeah.
So the timed images allow us to look at nest attendance rates, so which is how often the adult tern is at the nest with the egg or chick. And we can also learn a little bit about their behavior at the nest. So in this picture, you can see the adult is still incubating another egg, but the chick, the first chick that hatched, is out wandering around. So we can get interesting information about that. And lastly, from the cameras, we can look at chick diet. So I'm not going to talk about this I'm going to talk about it more later, so we're just going to skip over this for now, but we'll come back to the fish. So let's move on again. So the second topic I'm going to talk about here is nest site selection, habitat selection. There we go. Sorry, John. So when I'm at the nest sites, especially the camera sites, I have this awkward PVC quadrat that I place around the nest so I can take a few vegetation characteristics. And so I'm really interested to see what the terns are looking for at the nest sites. So what we do, we put it over a nest and then we measure vegetation height, the different cover, percent cover types of different things, the nest bowl substrate, and a couple other metrics. And hopefully in the future, we can use this to help manage vegetation at colonies potentially, and to determine if historical colony sites still have suitable nesting habitat. At some of these sites that used to have thousands of pairs of terns in Kodiak, for instance, maybe it's just not the right habitat anymore and they could still be used. We don't know, but this is a way to try to answer that question or potentially rule it out as a reason for why the terns aren't there. So in Kodiak, the typical nesting habitat is shown in this plot on the left side. It's usually kind of grassy with some forbs with a moss base, but the terns are pretty flexible and sometimes you'll see them in totally different nesting habitats. So, and it's different across the state. I'm sure what you see in Nome is different than what we see in Kodiak compared to Yakutat. So there's quite a bit of variability. All right, so let's go back to chick diet now. Sorry for jumping around a little bit. So luckily for us, adults carry fish in their bills. So often we can identify what type of fish the chicks are eating thanks to the pictures from the nest cameras. So in this picture, we can see that the chick is being fed a sand lance. And on the previous slide that we looked at briefly, that adult tern was carrying a juvenile greenling. So I do have a little bit of preliminary analysis that I'd like to share real quick. I think it's pretty interesting. So in this figure, on the vertical axis, we have the proportion of the diet of a variety of different groups of fish. And on the horizontal axis, we have the year. I've included some data from 1977 and 1978 when there was a little bit of Aleutian Tern work done in the Kodiak area. And I think it's a really interesting comparison to what we've seen so far from 2017 to 2019, and I'm assuming 2020, but I have not gotten to that data yet. So what you can see in the 70s, the tern chicks were being fed a lot of osmerids, which were mainly capelin in the Kodiak area. This also includes smelts, but this was mainly capelin. But that really dropped out of the system, it appears. And honestly, I've not seen a single capelin in their diet. I think these little tiny bars here in 2017, 2019 are some sort of smelt. So that kind of leads us to what happened to the osmerids. And I thank you, Kate, for this beautiful picture of a fledgling. But what happened to the osmerids? And is their sudden decline or absence from the chick diet an influencing cause of why there are less Aleutian terns in Kodiak now? It's hard to say. But when this data was collected, the data from the 70s, there were some colonies in Kodiak that were over 1,000 pairs. And I'm really excited to see 60 birds now, kind of thing. And a lot of those big colonies have no nests at them at all anymore. So this is something we're looking into. Maybe diet is one of the underlying causes of Aleutian tern decline. All right, so I've got one more slide, and then I'm gonna pass it back to Dawn, and then I'm done. So I'm gonna end on the isotope note. So along with chick diet, I'm interested in investigating the diet of female terns before they lay their eggs. So to do this, I'm going to use staple isotope analysis of eggshell membranes. I'm not going to go into very much depth with this. It's pretty technical. It would probably take a whole presentation to really explain in good detail, but hopefully this graphic can kind of simplify it a little bit. So I'm hoping to look at the ratio of nitrogen 15 isotopes to nitrogen 14 isotopes to see where the terns are feeding on the trophic web when the proportion of nitrogen 15 is higher then something's higher in the trophic level. So they're eating at a higher location in the food web. And kind of in a similar manner with the carbon isotopes, if you have higher proportions of carbon-13 isotopes versus carbon-12, it indicates a more marine diet. And that's kind of what we would expect in an Aleutian tern diet, unless they're foraging more in freshwater ponds or something, which we don't really know for sure. So when you plot them together, you can kind of get an idea of the diet niche space of that species. And since eggs are formed in a short window of time before they're being laid, I'm hoping that by using egg tissues, I can learn about tern diet in the waters around Kodiak right before egg laying. So once again, get at if good prey are less available in the waters than they used to be. So I have samples from 4 years in Kodiak, 2 of which were very poor nesting years and 2 of which were good nesting years. So I think it's hopefully going to be an interesting comparison to see if we can see this difference between poor nesting means they're feeding at a lower trophic level versus better productivity, a slightly higher trophic level. But that's very far from being done. So stay tuned once again. So that's all I have for you. It's kind of a whirlwind of all the projects going on in Kodiak. But thank you for listening, and it's back to Dawn now.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Jill. I'm sure everyone's impressed by how much you are working on. It is a lot. So I'll come back and highlight some of our other efforts to study Aleutian terns and really focus on our efforts to track birds at multiple sites in southern Alaska primarily. We're using satellite tags, which are a type of tag that transmits their location to a satellite network. So we don't have to recapture the bird to get the movement information. We get it by email every day. So really exciting technology. Aleutian terns are a pretty small bird, really, to carry this kind of tag. We're fortunate to use a real cutting edge technology. These tags that you see, you can see one there on the back of an Aleutian tern before we release this individual, weigh about the same as a dime, 2 grams. So they're a really advanced design and allow us to put them on these small birds without impacting their movements. They're still very capable of moving long distances whenever they care to. So we've tagged Aleutian terns in 3 years across 3 locations. Yakutat in Southeast Alaska, and in the Dillingham area in Bristol Bay, and then last year in the Kodiak Archipelago. This map that is on the right shows some of the results from the first 2 years from Yakutat and Dillingham. And the polygons that you see in green represent the area those birds covered from each of those capture sites. The capture locations are shown in by those yellow stars. And you can see that the birds moved around in the local area around those capture sites, but really didn't explore the state of Alaska very broadly. Most of the locations were within 100 kilometers of the capture site. They did move between multiple colony sites in these localized areas, but there wasn't much exchange between disparate regions of the state. So already some interesting findings from those early results or early efforts. And then I'll go into a little bit more detail about our most recent tagging effort, which was last year, 2019, in the Kodiak Archipelago. We captured at two sites, two of the sites Jill works at that are accessible via the Kodiak road system, Middle Bay and Burton Branch. We split a sample of 10 tags across these two sites, so tagging 5 individuals from each location. And a lot of birds did much what you would expect a nesting bird to do. This is a track of one individual that was captured at Middle Bay. It successfully hatched a chick and hung around at the colony until it migrated. That blue dot, kind of in the middle at the bottom of the figure, represents its departure for the season. It was heading off to sea to migrate to its wintering grounds in Southeast Asia. But prior to that, during the breeding season, it stayed pretty much in a local area and had the highest density of locations relatively close to the colony. We think this bird was associated with that site for the entire breeding season. But some other birds wandered a little more widely. And here's a couple of birds that explored other areas within the Kodiak Archipelago. The capture site here is in the red rectangle in the upper right of each of these maps. But each of these birds went to somewhere south and west of the capture site and clustered a group of locations there. This is the behavior we would expect if a bird was associating with another colony, potentially interacting with other adults at that colony, or if a bird were to re-nest, it would shift its center of activity to another site like these. The site on the right is particularly interesting. It wasn't possible to visit that site on the ground immediately after or during the visits by this tagged individual last year, but Jill actually made it to this site this past summer, and confirmed that this island did have an active colony this summer. There were birds seen from the air at that site last summer. So we think we learned where a new colony site is, or a previously unknown colony site. So this kind of gets back to an earlier question we've been working on addressing, and that's, are there colonies out there that we don't know about that might represent places where birds have shifted, and explain a little bit of that decline at known colonies. Some more interesting movements happened with some of the birds tagged at Kodiak last year, however. Some more wide-ranging movement. This individual did a couple interesting sojourns. Apparently, it was not nesting the entire summer, and went far into Cook Inlet on one sojourn, and then also crossed the Gulf and ended up a bit south of Prince William Sound, not all that far from Middleton Island, actually. So pretty interesting travel from this individual, and a little more large-scale movement than we've seen from previous tagging in Yakutat and Dillingham. But it only got more interesting. This individual went into Cook Inlet a short way into Kachemak Bay near Homer, and also circled the Kodiak Archipelago, which was interesting. But I mean, the really intriguing movement that this bird did was the movement that took it almost entirely across the Gulf of Alaska, and definitely beyond the Copper River Delta. So a really long-range movement that took it close to some areas where there were other colonies. Finally, this bird kind of was the champion of long-distance movements during the breeding season, and it got even all the way to the Yakutat area, where a major colony exists. So this bird showed us what Aleutian terns are capable of, or what movements they're capable of during the breeding season, and poses some interesting questions about how much this might be happening, and how connected birds across the state may be, and how much they may interbreed. So pretty fascinating results that we're only beginning to get glimpses of because of this novel tracking technology. So to kind of summarize some of the breeding season movement information, the takeaways that we're kind of digesting now, tagging does seem to show us places to look for new colonies. Most of the movements are in the region of tagging, but there may be greater connectivity across longer distances, for example, across the Gulf of Alaska, than we've expected from our early tagging efforts. But I really want to also show some of the migration data that we've gotten from these birds. We tracked quite a number of them now through their fall migration. We haven't seen a spring migration yet using this technology, but we're getting a good idea of their post-breeding dispersal and travel to the wintering grounds. And on this map, I've charted or mapped the track of two individuals, one from Dillingham, one from Yakutat. And you can see they both moved into the Bering Sea, crossed the Bering Sea, and came up against the coast of Kamchatka pretty closely. And these blue crosses show colonies, known colonies in Kamchatka, and you can see that these two individuals very likely intermixed with Aleutian Tern individuals from those colonies in Russia. So this is really tantalizing information that suggests our birds here in Alaska may know of nesting sites in Russia, may interact with birds that breed in Russia, and who knows, some individuals may move back and forth between Russia and Alaska for nesting. We don't know conclusively about that question yet, but we are working with a geneticist who will take a look at that question, both look at the genetic structure of Aleutian terns across Alaska, but also start looking at some tissue from Russia as soon as we can get it out of Russia and to the US, which is a bit of a permit challenge. But we're working on that part of it as well. And so we think there's the potential that this could be one large interbreeding population with very little differentiation between Russian birds and Alaskan birds. That would be really critical information for a conservation assessment for the species. If these are all one mixed population, and the birds in Russia are doing okay, then we would worry a bit less about the declines that may be happening in Alaska. So certainly very relevant to what we're seeing here, and an important piece of information we're working on acquiring. I want to show you the entire migration, however. This is an individual that crossed the Pacific, the North Pacific, along the Aleutian chain. Again, touched upon the Kamchatka Peninsula, and then traveled down to Hokkaido in Japan, and traveled between Hokkaido and the main island of Honshu into the Sea of Japan, along the Korean Peninsula, crossed the Yellow Sea, skirted the coast of China for quite a ways, then Vietnam, and ended up in the South China Sea, did something really interesting, crossed the Isthmus of Thailand, and ended up, if you will, in the Indian Ocean. So a really remarkable migration, one that very few species of bird performs, really novel for a seabird species, and a great connection between Alaska and a part of the world we often don't think of as being connected, this area of Southeast Asia. Another example of migration that I'll show, just to kind of wrap up, is this individual that had a fairly similar route to get to Japan, but came along, actually entered into the Yellow Sea a little bit more in China, but departed the coast of China at Taiwan, headed south from there into the Philippines, and then curled back to the east after traveling through the Philippines, and skirted the northern shore of New Guinea, ending up in Papua New Guinea and some other areas of the Southwest Pacific. So a pretty, again, a pretty amazing migration, one that's quite unusual among birds. Also shows that that Aleutian terns don't all go to the same place. They seem to go to Southeast Asia along similar routes, but then fan out once they get there. I know from my own experience in Southeast Asia, you generally see these birds pretty dispersed. You don't see large numbers of them in any single location. So much like on the breeding grounds, you don't typically see large numbers of them in any one place, at least in recent decades. So a pretty unique bird doing a very unique migration. And I think with that, since we have a small group, we could just start taking questions. I think hopefully we've intrigued you with kind of some of the mysteries of this bird, and some of the neat, exciting research that's happening to better understand this species and understand their conservation concerns. But with that, I guess we could turn it over to Gay to moderate questions, or people could just ask away and ask either Jill or I, whichever one presented something, or we can hand off questions to the more appropriate person.
Well, first off, let's just say thank you to you both. And for those of you who are into Zoom, if you go down to reactions, you can, on your toolbar, you can give them either a clap or a thumbs up. So nothing but positive here. So thank you so much. That was actually really interesting. We're open for questions. And I want to just say that as you were talking, I was thinking, Don is actually talking to us tonight from Maine. So for Alaskans, I think we can appreciate your time difference there. Usually it's a little bit backwards for us, but for you, you're really, I was like, I didn't even think about it. Holy cow. So well done. And especially since it's getting on there in the evening. So does anyone, well done. Does anyone have any questions? I know there's already questions in the chat, but does anyone have a direct question right off the bat?
Yeah, this is Kate. Can you hear me?
Yep.
So I'm curious, the colony that, or the terns that you saw in the photographs that I sent to you from last year, do you suspect that those birds would have nested there, or would they have perhaps moved there from another nesting location to just stage and feed their young?
Yeah, I think with terns and fledglings that are fully flight capable, it's always a tough question because there's often post-fledgling parental care. Parents are feeding chicks after they can fly and will take chicks to places where there is good food. So it's always a difficult question. I'm sure birds that breed in the Nome region, within a few tens of kilometers, would quickly take their fledglings to wherever food resources were favorable. So it might be that the fledglings you photographed were from the Nome region, but maybe not exactly the specific location where you were to see them. So I think that would be my thoughts. I don't know, Jill, if you have anything to add.
I think that makes sense. It looked like those chicks were pretty old and definitely flight capable, so they could have moved a little bit. I think if you see a little bit of down still sticking out of their head feathers, usually they kind of stay close to where they were hatched, at least my experience with the fledglings at the one colony that seems to produce fledglings in Kodiak, that they seem to stick around until all the down's gone and then for a little bit of time, and then they can move out potentially if they need to. So yeah, that is a difficult question though, it's hard to say.
Yeah, they just showed up there so obviously all of a sudden around the 1st of August, and we've been by there many times before and seen no sign of them. So, and they did all seem to be capable of flight, the ones that we saw.
Yeah, that sounds like it was probably a group that came in from somewhere, a local area maybe.
Yeah, okay. And then I was wondering, what is the furthest from the coastline that they're known to have colonies?
Yeah, I think almost all colonies of Aleutian terns are within a kilometer or two of the coast, if not even closer. There's a couple places. There's one location on the Kenai Peninsula where I think it's 20 kilometers from the coast. That's pretty unique. They really are a coastal bird, unlike Arctic terns, which will nest on tundra, a long ways from salt water. Aleutian terns really do seem much more keyed in or locked in to the marine environment to forage.
Okay, thanks.
In the chat box, you also had a question. I think Kate just asked the first part of Carol's question, but the second was, could drone use endangered birds if they are flying?
Yeah. So the drones that have been used on Aleutian terns and most other terns as well are the quadcopters. So they don't move fast in a horizontal direction. Typically, they're relatively methodical or slower. It's unlike a fixed wing aircraft, for example, that needs to move fast to maintain lift. And in our experience, terns definitely recognize that they're there but the movement of the quadcopter is different enough from the normal aerial predators that they experience, like bald eagles, for example, that they don't recognize a drone as a predator. So you can actually fly quite low over them. If they're on a nest, for example, maybe you can get down as low as 10 meters over Aleutian terns without flushing them. They will kind of look up and watch the drone fly around, but they don't flush. And it seems that they recognize where it is and will avoid it in flight. So the collision risk, the inadvertent collision risk, seems low. So I'm not aware of any injuries to birds, to Aleutian or Arctic terns for that matter, or Caspians, from a quadcopter style drone. So it seems pretty safe for these species, and it's getting much more widely used now as a survey technique. So I think the body of experience is growing, and if there are any problems, I'm sure we'll hear about them soon, but I haven't heard of anything serious to date.
So it sounds, Carol has a question. So you're using drones frequently?
Yeah, we've been experimenting with drones pretty seriously for 2 years, 2018 and 2019. There was not very much done this summer of 2020, primarily because of COVID limitations and the fact that the federal government's getting tighter on using drones that source parts from China. But they're being used for a wide variety of seabird species and terns in particular, pretty successfully. For Aleutian terns, they're really the best way to survey large colonies that cover a lot of area or have a large number of birds that are really difficult to count during these opportunistic flushing events. That I think observers like Jill are pretty good at those counts up to 50, 100, maybe 150 individuals. But once you start getting above that number, it gets very difficult to be accurate, and the counts end up being biased low typically, where flying a drone, you don't flush them and you can count birds on the ground and get a pretty good estimate of the number of nests in a given area. And that's really most helpful when it's a large colony.
So thanks, Don. I have a question. So when hopefully the world will be a better place in 21 and you'll be up here in Nome, and what is it, the satellite tracking you were going to be doing here out of this region?
Yeah, we have one more year planned of satellite tagging terns. We'd really like to do that somewhere along the Bering Sea coast, as far north as possible. So Nome is a really great target location for us. We just know very little about the movement of birds in this region. We know very little about where there may be colonies. There is good information right around Nome and places where you all are looking and spending time, but so much of the Bering Coast is so little visited that we really think there'd be a lot of information gathered. We'd learn a lot by tagging individuals in the Nome area. So we're hopeful. I think we won't make a decision on that till spring, I'm sure, once we see what's going on with COVID and our other logistical constraints. But yeah, it's our hope that we can get up your way and meet many of you in person and do some good work there, learn a lot.
You have a question from Peter Bente on the satellite tracks. I think maybe if you can go to your maps. It says each red dot represents a day or other time interval.
Yeah, I can back up that slide. These tags are, they have a small battery on board that's charged by a solar panel. And they will attempt to get locations whenever they have charge. So in the summer in Alaska, because the day is so long and there's so much sun, we can get 20 or 25 locations in a day. When a bird gets to the equator and there's only 12 hours of sun, then the number of locations we get drops off a lot. It might be 5 to 10, could be even less. These maps have filtered out some locations because they're not all that accurate. We get some information with each location that helps us assess the quality of that point and how accurate it may be. And so these tracks have filtered out some of those locations. But in general, this migration takes a month or so. So you can imagine this map representing on average, 2 to 5 locations per day, maybe a little less. These terns are really amazing. They're capable of, making this trip that's, many thousands of kilometers over the course of a few weeks. They move pretty steadily. They don't seem to dally in any particular location until they've kind of reached a terminal point, and then we'll see them settle into a place for weeks before we eventually lose the signal from that tag. Really a very amazing migration. It's an interesting one. This bird, for example, was out in the open ocean of the North Pacific for a stretch of it, and then at other times hugged the coastline of various land masses quite tightly. These birds really use a diversity of habitats along the way. Quite versatile individuals.
And Peter also writes, can you normalize to daily position? Or maybe that was your answer there.
Yeah, what's sometimes done with these analyses is just take the best quality location per day. That's not what was done to generate these maps. I think these preliminary maps, probably the best interpretation is every 2 to 4 points represent a day's travel.
All right. That's great. Thanks. And
yeah.
Janelle's been waiting patiently. Hi, Janelle. I've been waiting patiently to ask it. She's got a diet question for you, Jill.
Hi, great talk, you guys. Jill, I thought the diet information you presented was really interesting. And I just wondered if the data you have from the 70s to more recent time frame, was that site specific or was that compiled across Alaska? What do we know about what they eat, say in Russia? Do we have more information about diet?
The diet data that I showed was just Kodiak specific,
Okay.
and I summed it across all of the colonies that I was at. And I think the data from the 70s was from the Cyclitic Straits area of Kodiak, but once again, just Kodiak data. I don't think there's much historic data at other sites in Alaska for Aleutian terns, and I don't know anything about Russia, but I don't think so, at least not that I have seen. They are doing camera monitoring in other locations in Yakutat, and I think the Copper River Delta this year. So they should have diet information as well from those sites for recent years. I haven't seen that, but we could get a hold of Susan for that.
Cool.
Yeah.
And before this call, sorry, go ahead, Don.
Oh, I would just add, Janelle, it's amazing how little diet information exists for this species. I mean, there really is a dearth. The study from the late 70s that Jill references, and one master's thesis done in the 80s in the Copper River Delta may be the only diet data that we can historically reference. It's so uncommon for people to be able to track chicks because those chicks are mobile, they hide in vegetation. And even Jill's work, the cameras at the nest only track chicks for the first portion of the chick rearing period. I mean, when Jill's really lucky, the chick chooses to stay in the general area and shows up on camera beyond a week or so, but it's really an uncommon event. So that's a really big gap in what we know about this species.
That's challenging. Thanks.
Yeah.
So earlier, before you all joined, we were talking about gnome, and I think, Don, you were asking if people come across carcasses to hold on to them. Certainly, I'm happy to send them to you, or people can send them themselves. But you're looking for carcasses. Would that help you, Jill, with your diet information, as well as, I'm not sure what you would be learning with the carcasses, but certainly we can keep an eye out for those things. And I have a question for Peter Benty, kind of rolls into this. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to think, I think it's for the genetics works, but if you find eggshells from Aleutian Tern nests, you could hang on to those, and that could someday maybe be used for isotope stuff, which could be interesting in comparison to the Kodiak stuff. So you see eggshells, just pick them up.
Okay. And for Peter,
Yeah,
oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Don. I'm sorry to cut you off twice. Terrible.
our primary purpose is the genetic study.
Okay.
But again, there's so little known about this species that we could potentially use carcasses for other purposes as well. We're really, this species is really a mystery in many ways, and even basic information is quite valuable.
And so this rolls into, I was trying to figure out a way that, you know, I don't know much about the subsistence use of terns. So Peter, this is where I was going to ask, is it sending Don and Jill to like the Alaska Migratory Bird Co-Management Council, or another entity that might be utilizing Aleutian terns for subsistence? Are they in the federal regulatory allowance? And if you don't know how to unmute, it's in the lower, on the bar over on the left. There's like a little microphone, if you're able to unmute. Or maybe he stepped away from the computer. So anyway, if any of the Alaskans in the group can think of a way like that, I was just trying to think of something that they could contact, a place they can contact that would be a good connection to potential sources for stomachs or genetic material if people are harvesting terns. We'll leave it at that, I guess. Peter might have stepped away. Any other questions for Don or Jill? All right, well, thank you again for a very nice presentation. I'm sorry we couldn't get more online, but like I said, I sort of scheduled you right in moose season, and that was my bad there. So, so thank you so much, and great to see familiar faces on the video as well. And with that, I better stop the recording.